All right, last time we had gotten started looking at the history and teachings of the Seventh-day Adventist, and so I want to continue that and just briefly review what we had gotten done. I think we got into the second big subheading, and under that is probably the longest point. He's got several subheadings under that that we'll look at as we get started today. So we said, again, it's the founding. Again, it's just amazing to me that people are in a religion founded on false prophecy. We said that William Miller said the end of the world is coming in 1843, and apparently he started preaching that in 1831. Didn't happen. Oh, I was off a year. Didn't happen. Oh, I was off another year. Didn't happen. And so that led to a division there in this movement. And we said the group that calls himself the Seventh-day Adventist today kind of followed the branch of James White and his wife Ellen G. White. And we looked at a few things that she said. And we're going to look at something else she said, too, in a little bit that didn't come true. And we're going to look at what the Bible says about that. Somebody that claims to be a prophet that says something doesn't happen, and how we view that individual. I won't reread all these verses to you, but the first point we mentioned, they try to make a distinction between the law of God and the law of Moses. They'll say the law of God is the literal 10 Commandments, what God put on the tables of stone. The law of Moses is what was revealed to Moses related to religious ceremonies, so to speak. Things, the feasts they were to keep, the sacrifice they were to offer, and so forth. So make a distinction between those two. So their point would be, when Jesus died, he took away the ceremonial law, but not the moral law. So that was not part of the law that was taken out of the way by Christ. Well, we looked at several passages here, and I won't read the entire passage. When you see the law of God and the law of Moses, that phrase used interchangeably. Very obvious. So we looked at Ezra 7 and verse 6. We're talking about Ezra being a scribe in the law of Moses. 6 verses later, it says Ezra, a scribe of the law of God. It's the same thing. There's not any difference, not any distinction. In Nehemiah, the same deal. It talks about, again, Nehemiah describing Ezra. This is about 13 years or so after the book of Ezra. But he's still on the scene. You see the law of Moses, 7 verses later, the law of God. No difference. When Jesus was taken to the temple at the age of roughly a month old, we see the same thing. So it talks about the things that they did in purification, talks about according to the law of Moses. Later on, as is written in the law of the Lord. It's the same thing. So to make a difference between that is just not the case. That does not exist. So God gave the law of Moses, and a couple of y'all made that point in some of the verses that we looked at the other day. It talks about the law of God given to Moses, or the law of Moses given by God. So it's the same thing. So God gave the law of Moses. Moses gave the law of God. We looked at 2 Chronicles 34:14 that said that same thing. Animal sacrifices were in the law of God. That's true. But so was the moral law too. The law was changed. We looked at that passage with you last time. Christ removed the first that he might establish the second. Again, there's so many of these passages that are so plain. Hebrews 10 and verse 9, it doesn't get much plainer. He taketh away the first, talking about the first covenant or the first law, that he might establish the second. The 8th point he makes under 1 talks about honor thy father and thy mother, and Jesus talks about Moses giving that commandment. Well, of course, God gave that commandment, but he gave it through Moses, who then delivered it to the people. Same thing about murder. He says that Moses gave you that law that says don't kill. The second point, and this is the one that we were on, I think we got to about the 3rd or 4th subpoint under this, and I'll slow down here in just a minute. The ceremonial law only was nailed to the cross. That's what the Adventists will say. So that the law of offering, sacrifice, and so forth, that's what was done away. The 10 Commandments were not part of the ceremonial law, hence not removed. The ceremonial law was the book. The moral law was on stone. So again, they try to make a distinction between the two. Again, in kind of a disclaimer, so to speak, as we mentioned. When you read about, we say, well, the Ten Commandments is taken away, so does that mean that I can murder some now? Does that mean I can steal some? Does that mean I can lie? Does that mean I can commit adultery? Of course not. All those things are carried over into the law of liberty. But we follow those things not because they were in the Ten Commandments on the tables of stone. We follow them because Jesus gave those in his covenant. The apostles declared that to us. All right. The first subpoint under this, Brother Jenny says only one law in the Old Testament. So over and over we see the law of the Lord. The law of God brought the law before the congregation. The law which the Lord had commanded by Moses. The law of God. The law of the Lord. The law of Moses. So there was one law, of course, in the Old Testament. Sometimes called the law of God, sometimes called the law of Moses, but it's the one and the same law. Two, the book of the law contained all 5 books of the Pentateuch, and we read these passages with you last time. The book of the law by the ark, or as Brother Bill says, that probably is better off to say in the ark. We're talking about the 10 Commandments that were placed in the Ark of the Covenant. Quotes the 10 Commandments. I think this is about where we had left off last time, if I recall correctly. Law of the Lord contained both moral and ceremonial law. Again, there's no distinction between that. So it's both. So it's the moral law, the 10 Commandment law, but also the law of sacrifices and so forth. The moral law has to do with man's relationship to man and are right within themselves. Ceremonial laws or religious laws are made right only by divine commandments and deal with man's relationship with God. Words in religion, when we see a thus saith the Lord, that's what makes that important. So when we see Jesus with the Lord's Supper, for instance, when he says, this do until I come. Well, why do we partake of the Lord's Supper? We're commanded to do it. So that makes it significant. If somebody had dreamed that out of their own mind, wouldn't be any significance to it. But Jesus said to do that, and that's what makes that important. In Mark 2:27, Jesus said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. A great passage. But again, God is the one that made that day holy in the Old Testament, specifically beginning with Moses. I don't know why I did that. Sorry about that. 10 Commandments were done away. 2 Corinthians 3:7 through 11. I'm going to read that later on and on another point. 10 Commandments were called a covenant. And here's some of the passages related.
10 Commandments were done away.
You don't think so, brother?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right. So the 10 Commandments are called a covenant. So here we have the 10 Commandments mentioned, but he calls it a covenant. And we're going to make a point with that in just a minute. So the 10 Commandments were a covenant. In Deuteronomy 4:12 through 13, this is Moses kind of rehearsing everything that had happened back 40 years before. It says, the Lord spake unto you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the voice of the words, but saw no similitude. Only you heard a voice. And declared unto you his covenant, which commanded you to perform, even 10 Commandments. And he wrote them upon 2 tables of stone. So the 10 Commandments, again, are called a covenant. 1 Kings 8:9. There was nothing in the ark save or except the 2 tables of stone in the Ark of the Covenant that was placed in the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and temple. But it had the 2 tables of stone, which Moses put there at Horeb when the Lord made a covenant with the children of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And you see that used in other places here. So it speaks of the 10 Commandments being a part of the covenant of the Lord. And of course, there was Aaron's rod that budded, that was in there, a bowl of manna that was in there, at least originally. The covenant of the Decalogue, another fancy way to say the 10 Commandments. Deca meaning 10, as you know, so the 10 Commandments. Covenant of the Decalogue was abolished. And we'll look at some of these passages in a little bit more detail here because, again, this applies not just the 10 Commandments, but to the entire Old Testament as far as being bound by it. And it's not just as we talked about before, it's not just the Seventh-day Adventists that have problems with this, but others do too. Others will try to bring this from the Old Testament into the New Testament and so forth. We cannot use the Old Testament to justify what we do religiously today. It is written for our example It's written for our learning. It's a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ, but we're not bound by it as an authoritative law anymore. Look at what Jeremiah 31 says. Y'all are familiar with this. This is quoted in Hebrews 8. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I'll make a new covenant. A new covenant. Like the Ten Commandments, part of the old covenant. I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break. Talking about the old covenant, the old law. Although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbor, and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I'll remember their sin no more. And that's the most exciting point about this new covenant is actual forgiveness. The old covenant didn't have actual forgiveness. The wrath of God was appeased temporarily with these animal sacrifices. But Jesus is at the heart of this new covenant. And through him, we can have true forgiveness of our sins. And what a great blessing that is for each of us. And again, we're talking about putting the law in the heart. Reminds me of in the Sermon on the Mount. Several times, I've always been impressed with this. When you look, Jesus wasn't contradicting what Moses said, but he was kind of elaborating on it. He says, you've heard it said, thou shalt not kill. By saying to you, don't even hate your brother. And you see that in a number of things that Jesus says there. What is he saying? If my heart is right, my actions will follow. That's the whole point. So this is a law that is in our inward parts, and it dictates the actions that we take. This from Zechariah 11, verses 10 through 14. Zechariah said, I took my staff, even beauty, and cut it asunder, that I might break my covenant, which I'd made with all the people. So again, I'm talking about that old covenant, which God's saying, I'm breaking it with you. It was broken in that day. And so the poor of the flock that waited upon me knew that it was the word of the Lord. And I said unto them, if you think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized at of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Then I cut asunder mine other staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. And of course, that passage has always been impressive, talking about the price, predicting the price that would be paid for Jesus, 30 pieces of silver. But again, in that context, talking about breaking that old covenant. Bless you, brother. The old covenant being broken, not being bound by that old law. Hebrews 8, 6 through 8 and 13 deals with Jeremiah 31, and I skipped some of that because it's restated there, but let me read a part of this right here. But now hath he obtained, talking about Jesus, hath obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant. Again, it's so plain, and what a great blessing that is. The Old Testament, as great as it was, we're under a better covenant today, which was established upon better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then should no place have been sought for the second. Again, the old covenant, the old law, beautiful, inspired, but there's no true forgiveness. It was lacking in that.
Suppose all commandments, the 10 commandments are in the new covenant, with the exception of
That's the Sabbath day.
to keep it holy.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I saw a poster one time in a restaurant, and it had the 10 commandments, and so it had the 10 commandments here, and then it had those same laws in the new covenant, which was pretty neat. But for the Sabbath day, it did have a verse for the Sabbath day, and it was I think as on one thing I'm going to share with y'all, talking about the rest in Hebrews 4. If you look at the context, the rest in Hebrews 4 is talking about that eternal rest, talking about heaven. But yes, I agree with you, brother. So there's no doubt that 9 of those 10, you can find it in the new covenant, in the new law. It says, for finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant. And then he quotes this that we just read, and then jumping ahead, in that he saith, the new covenant, he hath made the first old. The first covenant is old. Now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. So again, that binding power of the old law was done by the cross of Christ. And even with the Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem, like Brother Bill brought up the other day, why don't the Jews, why don't they practice the animal sacrifice anymore? Basically because they weren't able to, because the temple was completely obliterated and this sort of, but you think they would have rebuilt the temple and all that, which they didn't do. But anyway, it's vanished away. Hebrews 9, I've always been impressed with this passage too. Verse 15, and for this cause he, Jesus, is the mediator of the New Testament. He is our mediator, that by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament. That's why there's a change. So we can have literal forgiveness, actual forgiveness through him. They which are called might receive the promise of eternal inheritance. For a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is a force after men are dead, otherwise it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth. So Jesus, people sometimes say, well, is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John part of the New Testament? Jesus is still living. Of course, he's reading his will during that time, but it didn't go into effect until after his death. And even more specifically, when the will was read there in the book of Acts. All right, point 9 under the second Roman numeral. The Decalogue was done away. Ephesians 2, 14 through 16. He, Jesus, is our peace, who hath made both one. Jew and Gentile, he's made them one family, one body, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. What was the partition between the Jew and the Gentile? Well, he describes it here, the old law. It was a partition between Jew and Gentile. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances. So what did he abolish? The old law was nailed to the cross. For to make in himself of twain one new man, a Jew and Gentile, making them one, so making peace, and that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. And we talked about this before. There's reasons why you say, well, why did God do that in the first place? Well, he's trying to maintain a holy people to bring about his son. Always for the purpose of saving the world. And so I've always been impressed with the promise that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and verse 3. He said, through thy seed. Okay, Abraham, the promised Messiah is going to come through you. Through thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. So the Jews were to be a holy people to keep knowledge of the one true God, knowledge of his revelations alive, to bring about the Christ who then would save the entire world. So it was always his point. So while the old law, again, was trying to maintain the Jewish people, keeping them holy, it was always his intention that the gospel would be preached to everybody throughout the world. Colossians 2, 14 through 17, blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way. That's pretty plain. These ordinances were taken out of the way. When? Nailing it to his cross. When he died, it was nailed to the cross. And remember, we see that kind of symbolically when he died, the veil of the temple being rent, being torn. We're no longer under that. I think that was God's message to mankind. We're no longer under that covenant. And having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of an holy day, or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of the things to come, but the body is of Christ. And Paul there, I read that for years and really misunderstood what that was saying. What it's saying is, don't let somebody judge you for not observing those things in the old covenant. That's what that's saying. That you don't observe the Sabbath day. You don't observe these feasts. Don't let somebody judge you for that. It's been nailed to the cross. 10, I think this is the last one under part 2 right here. The whole law was done away at the cross. And here's, again, a couple of cross references here. Acts 15, 5 through 11. Remember, this is the big conference they had in Jerusalem to settle the question of, all right, do these Gentile converts, do they have to be circumcised? Do they have to keep the law of Moses? It's pretty plain what they came down and said. So here's the result of that. But there arose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed. So here are Jewish Christians, Pharisees, these are believers. But again, they had an issue with this too. So, well, they need to be keeping the old law. And so here's what they were saying that it was needful to circumcise them, these Gentile Christians. They need to be circumcised and to command them to keep the law of Moses. They got to follow the old covenant. And the apostles and elders came together for to consider of this matter. And when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, Men and brethren, you know how that a good while ago God made choice among us that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe, which happened with Cornelius in Acts 10. And God, which knoweth the hearts, bear them witness, giving them the Holy Ghost, even as he did unto us. Notice this, and put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. Now therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? We weren't able to keep the old law ourselves. We weren't able to keep it faithfully. But we believe that through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, we should be saved even as they. Salvation is through Christ and not through the old law. So he's clearly saying that is not something that is bound on New Testament Christians. Romans 6:14 is another that Brother Jennings used. It says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. How plain is that? You're not under the law. Now, again, we've talked before, some of our religious friends will say, well, we're not under any law at all. That's not what that passage is saying either. We're under the perfect law of liberty, James 1:25. We're not under the law. We're not under the old covenant. It's been done away. We're now under grace, the dispensation of grace, the gospel of Jesus Christ. Romans 7:1-6 says, know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law. So he's talking to the Jewish mindset right here in Romans chapter 7. How that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. For the woman which hath an husband is bound by the law to her husband so long as he liveth. But if the husband be dead, she is loose from the law of her husband. And he makes a point with this. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she should be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. Wherefore, my brethren, so that the point he's trying to make, ye also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ. Pretty plain. We're dead to the law through Christ. He took it out of the way. I'm not bound to keep those things in the old law. That ye should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. We now, as the church being the bridegroom of Christ, we're now a part of that body. For when we were in the flesh, the motions of sins which were by the law did work in our members to bring forth fruit unto death. But now we are delivered from the law. That's pretty plain. We're delivered from the law, that being dead wherein we were held, that we should serve in newness of spirit and not in the oldness of letter. We don't serve in the oldness of the letter. We don't follow the old covenant. We follow the new covenant, the one of the Spirit, the gospel of Christ. Galatians 3:21-25. This is another that is just very plain to me. Is the law then against the promises of God? God forbid. For if there had been a law given which could have given life, verily righteousness should have been by the law. And in the book of Romans, he discussed that too. In Romans chapter 3 and Romans chapter 5, if someone could have kept the law perfectly, Jesus would not have had to die. He had to die because that was impossible to do. So there was no law that could have been established so that somebody could be justified by the law without Jesus Christ, is the point. We need Jesus. It says, for the scripture hath concluded all under sin. Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans 3:9-10, about 10-12. There's none righteous, no, not one. They've all gone astray, quoting Psalm 14. But Scripture hath concluded all under sin, that the promise by faith of Jesus Christ might be given to them that believe. But before faith came, and B.W. Johnson talks about this, that's sad. There's 5 places in Galatians 3 where the commentator should have put a "the" in front of the faith and didn't. So that make it easier if it said the faith, that is the gospel, and this is one of those places. But before faith came, the faith, the gospel. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, shut up unto the faith, there's the faith, supposed to be the faith, which should afterwards be revealed. Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. But after that faith has come, again, the faith, we're no longer under schoolmaster. How plain is that? When the faith came that was revealed by Jesus Christ, we're no longer under the schoolmaster. And I've heard people talking about in the Greek, this really is not even talking about like a teacher, but somebody that would take you to the teacher. And that's what the old law does. It took us to the ultimate teacher, Jesus Christ. It brought us to a knowledge of him, which is why it makes it important to study the Old Testament. I can't fully understand the New Testament without the Old Testament. So it's important, but I'm not bound by it. Galatians 4, 1 through 8. And this is what the whole book of Galatians is about. Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, differeth nothing from a servant, though he be Lord of all, but is under tutors and governors until the time appointed of the Father. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time was come, I heard, who was it? It wasn't Flavor Nichols. It was Brother Cates. Brother Cates in 1996, I remember him preaching a sermon on this, and then he talked about each of the old kingdoms and the impact they had on Christianity, which unbelievable, great sermon. But anyway, I remember him quoting this passage. The fullness of time, Jesus came at just the right time in history. But when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his son, Jesus, made of a woman, born to Mary, made under the law. He was born under the old law, kept it perfectly, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son. And if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. Howbeit then, when you knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. So these Gentiles used to worship these false gods. They now have knowledge of the one true God, but then they're trying to go back into bondage under the old law is the point that he's trying to make there. Hebrews 7, 11 through 12. If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there's made of necessity a change also of the law. Whereas if there was not a change in the law, you couldn't call Jesus a high priest. Why can we call Jesus a high priest today? Because there's been a change in the law. He's not of the tribe of Levi, he's of the tribe of Judah. Yet he is a priest because we're no longer under that old covenant. Any questions or comments on this? I know that was a lengthy point. I apologize for the length of that.
And we're just talking about Christ redeeming those in the Old Testament, those that had been dead for 100 years or more. Their sins weren't forgiven until Christ came and redeemed them. It's interesting.
It is. So like I've heard, y'all have all heard people talking about when Jesus died, his blood flowed forward and flowed backwards. And that's a pretty powerful thing. All right, point 3, under Adventist tradition, the Sabbath is part of the moral law that's permanent. That's their position. All right, since it's part of that permanent 10 Commandments, we're still under that today. Well, here's some points from Brother Jennings. Again, I stole these from him, so these are his points. Yes, sir.
I grew up in North Georgia, just south of Tennessee, and just east of Cleveland, Tennessee is a Seventh-day Adventist town. And when you're driving along the highway, everything is open, and you go into this town on Saturday, and everything is closed. Nothing going on there. Maybe a church service might be taking place where you see cars there, but everything is completely shut down. And they did send people out into the area of North Georgia where I live, like the Mormons do, soliciting people, trying to get them to become members of their faith, which I found interesting. But,
yeah.
Anyhow, I don't know of any other places where there's a town totally devoted to Seventh-day Adventists.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Cleveland,
Well, it's like I told y'all last week, you know, when I think back to conversations I had with people, I don't know that I can remember having a conversation with a Seventh-day Adventist down here. So that's interesting.
We're pretty strong in that particular area.
Okay.
That's the only place I've ever run into them, actually.
Is that close to Cleveland, Tennessee?
Cleveland, Tennessee. I think it's just east of Cleveland. I don't remember the name of the town. You should look that up sometime. Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting. All right. 4 of the 10 Commandments, Brother Jennings says, are ceremonial or religious in that they deal with relationship to God. 6 of the 10 are moral in that they deal with man's relationship with man. Sabbath law is not social but religious. So it was part of this ceremonial law that they would say the ceremonial law has been done away. That was something that was part of their religious days that they observed. It was done away as part of the Decalogue. And I mentioned a minute ago, 2 Corinthians 3, 7 through 11, and I didn't read it there, but I want to share this with you here for just a minute. It says, but if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, well, what was written and engraven in stones? Well, the Ten Commandments are part of that. Was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away, how shall not the ministration of the Spirit be rather glorious? For if the ministration of condemnation be glory, much more doth the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. For even that which was made glorious had no glory in this respect, by reason of the glory that excelleth. Talking about the new covenant, the new law. For if that which is done away was glorious, the old covenant, much more that which remaineth is glorious. So these tablets of stone were done away. And so to the point, again, that Brother Lloyd made, and some of y'all have been making, we are under 9 of those 10 commandments. But we're only under those if it's brought in the new covenant. The Sabbath day, from what I can see, has not been brought into the new covenant for us. So that's not applicable to us today. Again, it was blotted out. We read Colossians 2 a minute ago. I won't reread that. Hosea 2:11, Brother Jennings mentions, says, I will also cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons, and her Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts. Now, again, I think this is applicable to us in the context there. I think it's talking about the judgment coming on Israel and that sort of thing. Some of us would cease because they're going into captivity, but I think that is applicable also to the new covenant. The Sabbath is a shadow supplanted by the substance. And here's some verses that Brother Jennings mentions. I didn't put the entire passage there in Hebrews 4, but just a couple of verses there just to illustrate this point. And this is the one, Brother Lord, I was mentioning, like on that poster. This is the one they used to show we're still under the Sabbath day today. So see what y'all think. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. What rest is he talking about? For he that is entered into his rest, again, when we die, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor, therefore, to enter into that rest, lest any man fall at the same example of unbelief. Again, that's not talking about the Sabbath day rest or a Sunday rest. That's not what that's talking about. It's talking about that eternal rest. We labor so that we make it to heaven is what that's talking about. But again, a beautiful passage. Hebrews 10 and verse 1. For the law having a shadow of good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually make the comers thereunto perfect. But here it talks about it being a shadow. And that's another interesting study. And I've heard sermons y'all have too of preachers talking about the shadows of things that are fulfilled in the new covenant, the typology, if you will. For instance, like I've always been impressed with the typology of the Egyptian bondage, of Moses being a type of Christ, Pharaoh being a type of Satan, the bondage that they were in being a type of sin, crossing the Red Sea being a type of baptism, which is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 10, the wandering in the wilderness being a type of living the Christian life, crossing the Jordan being a type of entering heaven. Very interesting, all those types of things you can read about in the Old Covenant, but there's so many relating to types and shadows. Galatians 4, 10 through 11, we read that to y'all a moment ago. Apostles never taught Sabbath keeping, but did teach meeting on the first day of the week. Acts 20, verse 7, we read this the other day. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preaching to them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued to speak until midnight. So one of the main purposes of their gathering on the first day of the week was to break bread, to partake of the Lord's Supper. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I've given order to the church of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, let every one of you lay by him in store, as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. Well, why did he command them to give upon the first day of the week? That's when they were gathering. That was the common meeting date for them. And there's a lot of, again, there's passages in the Bible we can look at to point that out, but also the post-apostolic leaders, the next generation, Justin Martyr and others, make it very clear that they were worshiping on the Lord's Day. The first day of the week is when they were worshiping. Part 6 under this one. No meeting of Christians after the death of Christ was recorded as having been on a Sabbath day. Now, somebody says, well, didn't Paul preach on the Sabbath day? Yeah, we'll get to that in just a minute. But as far as the church itself, met on the Lord's Day. Now, they met other days too, but the Lord's Day was their regular meeting day. Paul's preaching was often to Jews on the Sabbath in the synagogue in the book of Acts. We read that in many places. When he would go to a place like Thessalonica, he would start preaching in the tabernacle. When he would go to Antioch of Pisidia in Acts 13, he preached in the synagogue. And if there was a Jewish population in a city that he went, that's where he went first. Well, why? That's people that should have known God the best, should have been acquainted with the prophecies of Jesus. So that's where he went first, because that's where they were meeting. Doesn't mean it's saying that that's when the church was meeting. That's not when the church was meeting, but that's when the Jews were meeting. And Paul met when they were there, or went to see them when they were there. He preached, as did Christ, every day in every place. 8, all days of equal importance now, and he uses Romans 14:5 to make that point. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. The Sabbath was commanded to Israel. Deuteronomy 5:15 says, remember that thou wast a servant in the land of Egypt, and that the Lord thy God brought thee out thence through a mighty hand and by a stretched out arm. Therefore the Lord thy God commanded thee to keep the Sabbath day. So that was something that was commanded by God in the law of Moses. Exodus 31:15, 6 days may work be done, but in the 7th is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whosoever doeth any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. And this is one of those things that's interesting to me. Does God mean what he says? You read in, where is it? I won't say Leviticus 24, but I think that was the man that was cursing that was put to death. In the book of Exodus, I've forgotten the chapter now. But you remember the guy that was picking up sticks on the Sabbath day, and what happened to him? He was put to death. So think he was just picking up a few sticks. God's serious about what he says and means what he says.
Here's another question. Do the Jews still observe the Sabbath day for their worship services? Or do they do that on the first day of the week?
I believe they still observe the Sabbath day. Again, I'm not an expert on their modern day stuff, but I think that they do.
It says right there that's what they should do, according to
Yes.
since they have the first 5 books of the Bible as their guideline.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
But the Sabbath day is Sunday, is in the New Testament, right?
Well, that's a good point, brother. A lot of times, like the Catholic Church will talk about the Christian Sabbath. Well, there's no doubt that the Sunday is the Lord's Day for us. The New Testament doesn't call it the Sabbath, doesn't call it a Sabbath, but there's no doubt that the day of worship has been changed. Like even in the Old Testament, I don't know, I guess they had offerings and things that offer on the Sabbath, but the main thing was to rest on the Sabbath. And again, you really don't find that when you read the New Testament, but there's no doubt that Sunday is the Lord's Day today, the day of worship.
It says, there where it says one man esteems one day above another, and another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. What is that talking about? I mean,
That is a good question too. I tell you what, let's go back and get the context. I think the context he's talking about,
Remember the Lord to do good and do it not.
James 4:17. Here he's talking about, I think, like the eating of meats offered to idols and things like that will cause a brother to stumble.
6 says, he that regardeth the day regardeth it to the Lord, and he regardeth not the day to the Lord, he doth not regard it. He that eateth to the Lord, for he given God thanks, and he that eateth not to the Lord, he eateth not and giveth God thanks.
I think in the context, Brother Lord, if I recall correctly, he is speaking to the Jewish mindset about not causing their Gentile brethren to stumble and fall.
Eating,
So like
eating meats.
right. So like
Given to idols.
the Jews and of course Christians were commanded not to eat meat offered to idols as well in Acts 15. But of course, like the Jews had a lot of things they couldn't eat. They weren't allowed to eat pork and a long list of things that they could eat. And now in Acts 10 other places, I think 1 Timothy 4 talks about we can eat anything we want to. So they're being taught they can eat anything they want to. But then Paul talks about don't use that liberty to cause somebody to stumble. So I think that's part of that, they could eat anything they wanted to eat, but, be mindful of that brother that had problems with that. There's no special days that we observe other than, of course, Sunday, as Brother Donald pointed out. But we don't have to observe the Sabbath and all that, but some other that was brought up in the Jewish religion, that's still so I think that's the context there of being careful, particularly with some of those brothers have a problem with that.
That eating meats and offending our brother and all that is something we don't have to worry about today.
Right.
At that time it was.
Right. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Great point.
I think sometimes, Lord, this is just kind of opinion. I have to watch what I say in this regard because I know some feel differently about it. But it's kind of like some people today talk about esteeming one day above another.
Yeah.
We know that the Lord was not born on Christmas Day and he wasn't raised on Easter Sunday. But for somebody that's important to them, do we walk charitably toward that person when we point out how wrong they are about it? And I've just often wondered about that. A lot of times we make a deal out of that, and I'm not opposed to that, saying that we know that this is not, that December 25th is not the day of Christ's birth. Well, for a lot of people, they celebrate it that way. To me, what is the big deal? It's not it doesn't affect me. And the same way with Easter, sometimes that's the only time you ever have an opportunity to even tell people about Christ. Well, this is Easter Sunday. He raised from the dead on April the 3rd this year. Another year was March the 23rd or whatever, So people make a big deal out of those 2 days. And I'm just afraid sometimes if we're not careful about how we approach that to others who it means something to them, I guess is what I'm saying. It means nothing to us because of every day, as Joel has pointed out many times, every Sunday is the Lord's Day. There's no one or two special days for Christians who know better. And I think sometimes in Romans 14 and other places, what's the first Corinthians maybe? Sometimes, I'm just saying, sometimes we're a little harsh on people, sometimes who, that's a big deal with them. And, we sometimes criticize them for that. And I think we just have to be kind of careful about that because it means nothing to us. I mean, if it's Easter Sunday or if Christmas happens on a Sunday, we know to us that's not a religious day. That's not a religious holiday. Somebody else esteems that day more important than I do. And I just need to be careful about how I talk to him and how I broach the subject with him, I guess is what I'm saying. It's just a modern day example, and I don't know if that applies to what's said in Romans 14 or not, but it seems to have a little meaning in that regard.
I've heard so many times, and I'm sure you have too, people who are not religious, they say Sunday's just another day to me. In other words, they're saying there's no difference in Monday or Tuesday as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
Well, as we're leaving out of our house, our neighbor out there cutting their grass today. And so that's always been said to me. Like me and the girls, when we lived down here, we'd walk to church a lot of times, but you'd walk and you'd see little kids playing and all that and don't have any clue they ought to be here. It's sad.
They see them one day just like any other day, kind of like that's another meaning of that.
Yeah.
Sunday's just like a Monday or Tuesday.
Yeah.
They do Sunday's a day off. That's the
Yeah.
Yeah. They believe in that day of rest, don't they?
All right. The Sabbath was a sign between God and Israel. All right. The fourth point. This was interesting. And I'm wanting to say, I haven't delved into Jehovah's Witness, but I believe Jehovah's Witness teaches something like this. But the spirit of man is only his breath, which passes out of existence at death and is annihilated. So basically, just when you die, you're dead all over, is what that sounds like in reading that. Brother Jennings says, God is spirit. John 4, we're familiar with verse 23 and 24. Jesus said, "But the hour cometh and now is when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth." So God is a spirit. He is a spiritual being. Well, what does that have to do with us? Well, if we look at Acts 17, 28 and 29, we're the offspring of God. So if God is spirit, does that not mean there's a spiritual part of us? Paul quotes a Greek poet here and says, "For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. For as much then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is likened to gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's devices." So a great point he's making here, and a brilliant sermon there on Mars Hill. I haven't been there, but I've seen pictures of where Paul was standing, and that would have been awesome to have been there and heard this sermon. But he quotes our own poet and saying, well, think about you. If you're the offspring of God, you're not made out of stone and metal and all this. Why would you think that God is? Why would you make all these idols that you made there in your city? All right, thank you as always for your great attention, and Lord willing, we'll continue this next Sunday.
Verse you quoted a while ago, another verse, but what they said, when the spirit is breath, and when the spirit dies, or when the breath leaves the body, the spirit is dead. Do they believe in eternal punishment?
You know, that's a great question, brother. I don't know. Like I think it's Jehovah's Witness. I think like their view is that, I think they believe in, well, no, Jehovah's Witnesses believe in the 144,000, all that, don't they? But I think they teach, you know, the 144,000 in heaven and the rest on earth, and I think they teach that the rest are just dead, that they're not being punished.
1,000-year
So,
reign. That's what they teach.
Yeah.
so it's very, very bizarre, some of that.
But they gotta beat with zeal.
Well, that's a good point, brother.
They do.